The big comic book movie of 2004 was easily Spider-Man 2. The budget increased massively from the first one's $60 million to $200 million for the sequel. However, the second one made $783 million, slightly less than the first. The scriptwriter for Ordinary People, Alvin Sargent, who did an uncredited rewrite on the first film, was the sole screenwriter for this one. Sam Raimi directed once again, and the main cast came back as well. Willem Dafoe even came back for a cameo, despite his character being dead. Interestingly, Tobey Maguire almost didn't return as Peter Parker. He hurt himself working on Seabiscuit, and Jake Gyllenhaal was considered as a replacement. Maguire ended up recovering, and no replacement was needed. The villain for the second installment was Dr. Octopus. Early on in development, Black Cat and the Lizard were considered as villains. The Lizard would eventually be the main antagonist of the 2012 reboot. Dr. Octopus, a scientist who gets 4 mechanical tentacles attached to him, was played by the very talented Alfred Molina. His large appendages supposedly necessitated shooting in a 2.35 to 1 aspect ratio instead of the first film's 1.85 to 1. Also, unlike in the comics, in this film, Dr. Octopus is Peter's role model before his accident. Spider-Man 2 was well received by critics and audiences. It currently has a very positive 94% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. It won the Oscar for Best Visual Effects and was nominated for another in sound mixing. I was never that crazy about the Raimi Spider-Man trilogy, but this is probably the best installment, and this is largely due to Molina's compelling performance as Doc Ock. My favorite comic book adaptation of the year was Guillermo del Toro's Hellboy. The film cost $66 million to make and took in a modest $99 million worldwide. Hellboy didn't really have any big stars, as none of the cast were mentioned in commercials or listed on the poster. The film got good reviews, and deservedly so. It's easily among the better half of comic book films out there, and Ron Perlman is awesome as always as the title hero. The movie was followed by a sequel, Hellboy 2: The Golden Army. Over the years, there have been rumors of a third movie, but at this point, it seems like it will never happen. Another comic book film of 2004 was The Punisher, based on the famous Marvel character. It was the first film directed by Jonathan Hensleigh, who had been a producer and writer for years. He had previously written Jumanji, Die Hard with a Vengeance, and Armageddon. Thomas Jane starred as the Punisher, and John Travolta gave a decent performance as the bad guy. It got mainly negative reviews, partly due to a budget of only $33 million, and it only took in $54 million at the box office. The film was no masterpiece, but as far as comic movies go, it's definitely not among the worst. On the other hand, also released in 2004 was Catwoman, which is one of the worst movies ever made, and quite possibly the worst comic book film ever. Batman and Robin is close, but doesn't quite reach the lows of Catwoman. Catwoman is actually painful to watch, mainly due to the editing. It takes the ADD quick-cut style to the extreme, and there's an unnecessary cut every few seconds in most scenes. Another major problem is that the Catwoman character really only appears in name only. She isn't Selina Kyle, the iconic comic character that appeared on film a decade earlier, portrayed by Michelle Pfeiffer. Rather, in this film, she is Patience Phillips, a completely original character that never appeared in the comics. On top of all that, there's also a ridiculous amount of terrible, cheesy cat puns. Halle Berry is the title character, and her talents are completely wasted. Early in the film, she can't find a boyfriend, which is not very realistic for someone who looks like Halle Berry. The director of this film was Pitoff, who had worked on visual effects for French films such as The City of Lost Children. His only previous directorial effort was 2001's Vidocq, and thankfully he has not directed a theatrical release since then. Next we come to yet another comic book sequel, Blade Trinity. Guillermo del Toro did not return to direct the third one, and the duties fell upon David S. Goyer. Goyer had only directed one film previously, 2002's Zigzag, which also starred Wesley Snipes. He would go on to write several more comic book movies, including the Dark Knight trilogy and Batman vs. Superman: Dawn of Justice. The third film in the series had major additions to the cast, with one of these being Ryan Reynolds as Hannibal King. King was a character in the comics, but he hardly resembles the film version. The second addition was Jessica Biel as Whistler's granddaughter, who likes to make iPod playlists for killing vampires. Unfortunately, the film was not very good, and is usually considered the worst of the Blade trilogy. An unusual example of a comic-inspired flick is 2004's Alien vs. Predator. The characters obviously come from the film franchises that bear their names. But the idea of combining these franchises first occurred in comics starting in the late 1980s. In fact, these two even faced off against the Terminator, Batman, and Superman. The film, however, was unfortunately quite terrible. It has only a 21% approval rating among critics on Rotten Tomatoes. It's not entirely surprising it was so bad, as it was directed by Paul W.S. Anderson, who has made several clunkers, often based on video games. These include Mortal Kombat and the first, fourth, and fifth installments in the Resident Evil series. The smallest comic book film of 2004 was the French film Blueberry. It was directed by Jean Kounen, who has since directed Coco Chanel and Igor Stravinsky. The film is entirely in English because it was set in the American West, and it was marketed in the US as Renegade. It stars French actor Vincent Cassel, who gave a great performance in Gaspar Noé's Irreversible, and has appeared in many American films as well. Also appearing are Michael Madsen, Juliette Lewis, and Jimon Hansu. Hallucinogenic drugs are a big part of the movie. They use some great computer animation to show us the geometric patterns the protagonist sees. The exact drug used is not mentioned, but it seems to be based off ayahuasca trips. The film is adapted from the comic series Blueberry, written by Jean-Michel Charlier. It was illustrated by famed artist Jean Giraud, aka Moebius, who has an amazing surreal style. He even contributed storyboards to many science fiction films, including Alien, Tron, and The Empire Strikes Back. He also collaborated with cult director Alejandro Jodorowsky on his abandoned adaptation of Dune. I highly recommend checking out the comic series that Moebius and Jodorowsky worked on together, titled The INCAL. That's all for this video. Thanks for listening, and keep an eye out for part 9.